Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and welcome back to our Enemy AI mini-series. So far in this series, we've created our first enemy who's able to patrol around, attack. We've added some nice visual feedback for attacking, taking damage, dealing damage, and also death. With our first enemy complete, it's time we took this system we created and made a second enemy. So in just 2 videos, the first one focused mostly on visual elements, the second on code, we're going to create a hovering enemy who shoots projectiles. That's where we're headed in these next 2 videos. Let's get started. Alright, so we're going to be building on the base we set up with our first enemy, so I'm just going to make a copy of my kobold and then move him over onto this platform here where we've just got some space to move. I'm going to rename him as Flyer as he will be floating around, and at this point we're ready to get started on the visuals. For this series, I'm going to be using Matt's Art's Flying Demon 2D pixel art pack. This one is free for commercial use. That said, I recommend that you take a moment to rate it and just help the creator out. Once you've downloaded this one, we can grab it from our downloads folder, drag it into our project. Once we've dragged that in there, we can open it up. I'm going to be using the without outline version. And let's go ahead and shift click these so we can edit them all at once. I'm going to go with 16 pixels per unit. We'll then set our filter mode to point no filter to remove any blurriness and set it to the higher 32-bit setting so that we preserve our colors. At this point, I'm just going to click on my flyer himself and just change his sprite renderer's active sprite to be idle so that we now can see the correct enemy on our map. Now you can see that the flyer is actually oriented in the opposite direction of the kobold, so I'm just going to head into the sprite renderer here and flip him on the X so that he's facing the right way. At this point, we can take a moment to line up his colliders. I want to make this one cover sort of the head region as I don't really want him taking damage via his wings or feet. Because I want him to be a hovering enemy, I'm also going to add a new empty object here. We'll call this one Hover. Give it its own collider, and then we'll just set that underneath so that it kind of holds him up in the air so that it looks like he's hovering up above things. Well, I'll take a moment here to just adjust these so that they actually sit nicely on top of each other. Now when I hit play, you'll notice first of all that it's the wrong enemy as it's playing the kobold's animations. That said, you can also notice that his feet are elevated up off the ground. That's because of that collider we put on the feet, so the hover is doing its job, causing that second collider to stay up in the air. Now before we can do too much else with this enemy, we want to get his animation set up. I'm going to close up these other components here and go to the animator, and if we click on it, you can see that the kobold state machine here is totally intact still. I'm just going to head to my animations folder here and create a new folder for the kobold. I'll drag both the animator and all the animations in there. And while I'm at it, let's create another one for the player and just get this animations folder a little better organized. Finally, now let's make one more folder, this time for our flyer. And then I'm actually going to go into the kobolds and I'm going to just copy all of his animations and his animator and then paste them in here. And for the moment, I'm just going to rename all of these to Flyer. That'll just give us all of the base animations that we need, and we can change them to suit our needs as we go. Once we've finished renaming them, let's click on our flyer, and this is really important. Make sure that you change out his animator, putting the flyer one instead of the kobold. Now, when we head to our animator window, it'll still look exactly like the kobolds, but now we can set it up to use all of those new flyer animations we just created. Admittedly, they all still look the same for the moment, but at least now we're set up so that we can start creating our new ones. Alright, at this point I'm going to just drag my animation window up, and let's start with walk since that's the most commonly used animation. We can actually just begin by getting rid of all of these kobold animations with Command A or Control A and delete. And now I'll head to my flyer sprites, and I'm just going to shift click all of his flying ones in there. Remember, this is a looping animation, so we're going to want to repeat that final one an extra time. It'll be really fast, so let's drag this out so that it slows him down just a little bit, perhaps over about 30 frames. Now that's looking not too bad at the moment, but it feels just a little jerky to me. And the reason for that, if we open up our sprite editor, is just that each of these frames has its own special slicing to different sizes, which causes it to jump a fair bit. I'm going to change from automatic to using cell size, and I'm going to go with 79 by 69, and that should nicely capture each of these in a similar sized frame. We can slice that and apply those changes. And now when I hit play, it just feels a little more natural to me. Now the one other thing I want to change here is you'll notice that currently his pivot is set off to the side here, which means that anytime we flip him using our X scale, it's going to sort of look like he teleports a little bit to the left and right. So I'm just going to head back into the sprite editor, and I'm going to move the pivot point for each of these to the actual point I want it to be, which is roughly sort of in between his nose here. That way when he pivots, it'll actually look like he's turning around without that teleporting. Still looks pretty good when I hit play, and now when I flip him, you'll notice that he actually more or less stays in the same place and it feels more natural. Now just a quick side note, as I was working and doing the flipping here, I did end up leaving him with a leftward orientation, so a -1 on the X, and if you're following along, you'll probably want to do the same just so that your work matches what I'm doing here. Now the last little thing I'll change here is that I'd like him to actually move up and down a little bit as he flaps his wings, so let's head into our sprite editor one more time. We're just going to move this pivot up and down a bit, so that he has a sudden push upward each time he flaps his wings. There we go. That's looking pretty good, and it'll look even better once we get him moving. All right, next up we'll set up his sort of run animation, which will just be a faster version of this. So let's Command A and copy all of this. We can then head to run, where we can delete the existing frames and then paste them in. All I'm going to do here is speed this one up, so it takes place over more like 20 frames, and we just get a faster version of his flying. All right, that one's done. Next up, let's head to our idle animation. And again, we'll shift click all of the idle ones and make sure to repeat the final frame as it's a looping animation. Again, I'm going to drag this one out over about 30 frames, and when I hit play, it's actually looking pretty good. That said, I do want to do the same adjustments I did before, so let's set this to slice by grid size, use the 79 by 69, and again, I'm just going to slide my pivot point over kind of in the middle of his nose, except that I'm going to have him appear to rise up as he flaps his wings. We can apply those changes, and now that's looking pretty good. Next up is our attack animation, and you'll notice we have these two animation events here, which we are just going to leave as is for now. One is when the attack actually happens, the other is when this attack animation finishes. We'll deal with those again in a moment. Let's grab all of our attack animations though and drag them in here. Again, we'll drag them out. I'm going to go over about 30 frames. That's looking pretty good. Now I'm just going to time this up though so that the attack event plays when we actually want him to fire his projectile, which we'll set up in the next video, and then make sure the other animation event just lines up with the end of your animation. Again, while clicked on the sprite, let's open the sprite editor. Here we can slice it by cell size again, and once more we'll go with the 79 by 69. And then just going to apply the movement of the pivot again over to the middle of his nose, also this time having it slightly rise and fall so that when he pushes down with his wings, he rises up, so it looks like he's actually kind of hover flying a little bit. Now when I hit play, I like the way that's looking. He kind of has his rise twice throughout the animation. That said, it's feeling really fast. I'm just going to drag this one out over a little bit longer time and then adjust my animation events to match. All right, next up we've got our damaged animation, and here I'm going to leave the color change, that flashing red, but remove the cobalt sprite. One thing that's nice about this flyer is that we've actually got a damaged animation, so we can grab all of those hurt frames and drag them in here. Now, one thing that's a little different is that this one actually has a frame that flashes white, and now that kind of blends with our red. You can decide if you like that or not. You could remove the color altogether, so he just flashes white. If you wanted to, you could also just remove that one frame that flashes white, and so you just get the hurt without the flash. I'm actually just going to leave it all there, as I think it looks good. The red's consistent with what we're doing with our other enemies, and honestly, I think it looks pretty decent. Once again, let's head into our sprite editor. I'm going to make sure that we slice this by cell size, once again using 79 by 69, and then let's adjust our pivot so that it's over here kind of by the nose. Now it's a little hard to tell where exactly the nose is, so here I'll actually just use the numbers that we've got down below. If you've moved it just a little bit, it will enable those numbers, and we can make sure that it's in the exact same place for each of these frames if we like. So again, for each of them, you'll just have to move it first, then you can punch in your numbers. And I'm also just gonna make sure that the very first frame has the exact same numbers. All right, let's apply those changes and exit out of here. Next up, we can create death. Now we don't actually have a death yet, so we're gonna have to create a new clip here. We'll head to our animations folder, find our flyer specifically, And let's call this one Flyer Death. Now, if you go to set this one up, you're going to notice that there's like 70 frames. That's a problem. Let's open the sprite editor, make sure that we slice this by cell size again, 79 by 69, and that will clean things up quite a bit. While we're in there, let's also just grab this pivot point and put it roughly where we want it to be in the center of the eye so that the cloud actually appears in the same place as our flyer. I'm just going to go through and do that for each of these now, kind of just giving them a rough idea of where they're supposed to be first of all. And then you can actually go through each one and give it the exact same location as the first one if you like. Feel free to make it rise up a little bit if you want the smoke cloud to rise or something like that, but I'm just going to keep it with the same settings as the first frame. Now that we have a more reasonable number of frames, we can just drag them all up here onto our depth, and that actually looks pretty decent. That said, we do want to have the smoke completely disappear at the end, so I'm going to just hit record, move one frame beyond this, head to my sprite renderer, and here I'll just make it so that on the final frame my alpha goes to 0. Now that would have it fade out throughout the entire thing, so I'll make it so that it is at full alpha on the second last frame, and then just in that last frame it disappears. At this point we can drag the whole thing out so that it takes a little longer, like say roughly 24 frames, 25, and there we go, that's looking pretty decent. Now before we forget, let's just search that flyer death animation we just made and make sure that we turn off loop time as we only want it to play once. At this point we can open up the animator, make sure you're clicked on your flyer so you see the right one. I'm just going to move death up to the top here and rename it as a more general death so that any enemy with a death animation can reuse this state. At this point I'm just going to leave it unconnected, and remember that moment earlier when I was flipping him and I left it on the leftward orientation? Let's just put him back facing right like our kobold does, and we'll want to continue that throughout the series. Now when we hit play, he'll actually be oriented the right way and able to use his detection to tell that there's a cliff there. That's working pretty good, though when we come to the left here, you'll notice that we're running into some trouble. Essentially all that's going on here is that this guy needs different detection from what our kobold had. When I turn on my gizmos, and they may be a little hard to see for you, you can see that our ground one still goes down into the ground, but his wall check is kind of in the middle there, and it's nowhere near the wall. With our flyer, we're going to need more than one of these checks. We're going to want one up high, probably one in the middle and one down low, so that he can detect obstacles of different heights. Alright, this is the moment where we get to move beyond just the visuals and actually change some of what's happening under the hood. So first of all, if we open up our enemy script, we've got this kobold config here. We're going to want to change this so that we have one for our flyer. I'm just going to duplicate it, rename this one to be flyer, and then I'll go to my flyer and make sure that we drag it in there. Now we do have one other reference in our enemy senses, so we'll also want to change that reference there. And then when we open this up, the only thing I'm going to do right now is I just want to give him a little bigger of a wall check because of the way he's angled. I'm going to change this one to be about a 1.5 length. You'll notice as soon as I do that, if my gizmos are on and I'm clicked on the flyer, that blue line is now significantly longer, and that's going to help a lot with our wall checking. That said, we're still going to want a higher and lower wall check. And additionally, I also just want to make sure that we get these colliders in the right spot now that we've kind of changed the way our enemy functions. Now when I click on the flyer, those look pretty decent. All right, once again, our ground check is actually working just fine, but we need to add a couple more of those wall checks, and for this we're going to head into our enemy senses. All right, so inside of here, the first thing we're going to do is just change this transform wall check into an array of wall checks. That way we can have as many as we want. This will make our isHittingWall method a little more complex, so first of all, let's put it into full curly brackets. Next, I'm just going to quickly make a reusable variable here for our direction that we want to cast our check in. This will be vector to right, and we'll multiply that by our enemy's facing direction, so it'll be either positive or negative depending on which way he's facing. Now we can loop through every transform, we'll call them check, inside of that wall checks array. So different enemies can have a different number of checks depending on how you want to set this up. And now what we can do is for each transform that's in that array, we're just going to create a bool, and we'll call that bool hit wall. So true if there is a wall, false if not. Here we can cut and paste that physics 2D raycast in here. And the only difference is that this time instead of wall check position, we'll just use check.position. So the check we're currently looking at. And our direction we're going to shoot this in is just going to be our dir, the one we just calculated a second ago. With this done, instead of having a single wall check, we can now loop through the entire array, and at each step, if one of them hits a wall, we can simply return true. There's a wall in front of us and we need to turn around. Now, if we make it through the entire for each loop and we've found nothing, we can return false as there's clearly no wall and we can continue doing what we're doing. Now at this point we're kind of done, except for the fact that our gizmos aren't going to match, and so let's head on down there. We'll still use the color blue, but once again we'll calculate a direction. Same thing as before, this will just be a vector to right multiplied by our enemy's facing direction. And similar to what we did above, we'll again make a for each loop where we go through every transform, which we'll name check, in our wall checks array. Then we'll do this gizmos draw line for each of them, just making sure to change the wall check there to check, and instead of a vector to right times enemy facing direction, we'll just turn this to our direction. When I get into Unity, I'm noticing a couple of errors. The first is just that I accidentally did a lowercase f on facing direction and it should have been upper. If we just fix those two instances, we'll get rid of that error. The next is just telling us we can't use an equal sign to compare a vector 2 and a vector 3 since our draw gizmos wants a vector 3. So let's just change our direction to a vector 3 value and that'll actually get rid of that error, no problem. Back in Unity, if I click on my flyer and head over to enemy senses, I now have an array that I can drag my wall check into. That said, I want more than one wall check. So I'm just going to duplicate this a couple of times. And then I'll just grab each one, dragging them into a high, medium, and low position. Then when I click on my flyer, I can lock the inspector and drag the new wall checks into my array. And while it's hard to see in this recording, I now have 3 different lines checking for wall. With that done, my patrol is working nice and I'm detecting that wall just fine. At this point, then we can run a little bit of a further test, seeing how our other logic is working. I'll just bring my player over, and while my Cinemachine is cutting off my view, you can still see that things are kind of working. The enemy is trying to attack, even though he doesn't have a projectile yet, and I'm able to attack him, though I'm missing most often, and I'm also getting an error when I try to attack. Now the reason for that message is simply that in my player's combat script, every time he hits an enemy collider, he's looking for a health script. But our enemy now has 2 colliders, one for his hover, and the hover doesn't have a health. That's what's giving us that error. This is actually a pretty simple fix. We can just go to our hover object and make sure that the layer doesn't belong to our enemy layer. For this, I'm actually going to create a brand new layer, which I'll just name hover. We'll make sure that we apply that to the hover object, and then let's edit and go to our project settings so that we can decide how the collision works for this object. If I go to Physics 2D and go to my layer collision matrix, I'm just going to make sure that the hover here does not connect with player. That way I can still run underneath the enemy and slide and stuff and not affect him. While I'm at it here, I'm just going to adjust the confiner on my camera that we set up earlier so that I can actually access this entire part of the level. All right, with that, we can now head into the game. Our enemy is patrolling properly, and when we run over to attack, we'll find that we can actually deal damage with him. We're getting no errors, but we can also go underneath him, sliding to avoid his attack. Now, you'll notice that we obviously have some problems, as this enemy is behaving really a lot like our kobold. And so in the next video, we'll set up his projectile attack so that he can have some different behavior. That said, we'll leave that for the next video. Hope to see you there. Until that time, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.